On Maple Lane, the police were called on a suspicious black man, a homeowner who was simply walking his dog. Little did anyone know, this man was the new chief of police. What happened next left everyone stunned. But let's start from the beginning. The residents of the quiet, leafy Willow Grove neighborhood were used to stability. Every house on Maple Lane looked like something out of a brochure. Neatly trimmed lawns, vibrant flower beds, and pristine fences. When a new neighbor moved into the old Victorian house on the corner, gossip and speculation spread like wildfire. Jacob Carter, a man in his early 40s, always well-dressed and composed, piqued the curiosity of the neighbors. Nobody knew what he did for a living, or why he had moved to their idyllic community. One person, in particular, paid him special attention. Linda Whitmore, the self-proclaimed captain of the neighborhood watch. Linda, a 50-year-old woman with a perfectly maintained garden and a passion for control, immediately saw Jacob as a threat to their way of life. She spied on him through her curtains, jotting down notes in her trusty notebook, recording every detail. His black SUV with tinted windows, his late-night outings, and his walks with his large Doberman. To Linda, something about Jacob just didn't sit right. One evening, as she watched Jacob walking his dog in athletic gear, Linda grabbed her phone, her plan already forming. 911? I'd like to report a suspicious individual. He's walking around with a big dog. Looks dangerous. I feel unsafe. Her voice was filled with dramatics, and the story grew more alarming with every word. Minutes later, the tranquility of Maple Lane was shattered by the sound of sirens. 2 police cars pulled up right outside Jacob's house. Neighbors peeked out from their windows, while Linda stepped onto her porch in her robe, watching the scene with a triumphant expression. Jacob, standing calmly with his dog on a leash, observed as 2 officers approached. Officer Daniels, a burly, confident man, led the way, while the younger, nervous Officer Taylor followed closely. "Good evening, sir. We received a call about a suspicious individual in the area. Can you state your name and reason for being here?" Daniels said in a tone that left little room for argument. "This is my neighborhood," Jacob replied calmly. "You live here?" the officer pressed. "Yes, in that house right there," Jacob said, nodding toward the Victorian home. Linda interjected, pointing an accusatory finger at Jacob. "That's him. I saw him looking around at houses. He doesn't belong here." Daniels frowned, gesturing for Jacob to keep his hands visible. "Your ID, sir," he ordered, preparing to escalate the situation. The gathered neighbors watched in silence, some filming the encounter, others exchanging glances. The tension grew thicker, but Jacob remained composed. Jacob stood on the sidewalk, holding the leash firmly as his Doberman sat quietly by his side. Officer Daniels stepped closer, clearly aiming to assert dominance. "Your ID," Daniels repeated, his tone sharper now. Jacob calmly reached into his pocket, took out his wallet, and handed over his identification. Officer Taylor read the name silently but said nothing. "You live here?" Daniels repeated, seemingly intent on ignoring the obvious. "Yes, in that house," Jacob said again, motioning toward his Victorian home. "I moved in a couple of weeks ago." "It's strange that no one here knows you," Linda chimed in from her porch, hands on her hips. "We know everyone in this neighborhood, and you're definitely not one of us." The crowd began murmuring. A few neighbors looked doubtful, but Linda pressed on. "His car is suspicious. Those tinted windows, what's he trying to hide?" "All right, sir," Daniels interrupted. "We'll verify your ID. Wait here." The officers walked back to their squad car, leaving Jacob under the scrutinizing eyes of the growing crowd. Linda turned to her neighbors, raising her voice for all to hear. "See, I told you he doesn't belong here. He shouldn't have moved into our neighborhood." Jacob, hearing her words, finally looked at Linda directly, his gaze cold. "You know, Mrs. Whitmore," he said quietly, his voice steady but firm. Perhaps the problem isn't me. Maybe it's your perspective. Jacob's words caused a ripple of whispers through the crowd, but Linda simply scoffed, rolling her eyes dismissively. Meanwhile, in the squad car, Taylor was reviewing Jacob's ID nervously. He leaned toward Daniels. This name sounds familiar. I think I've seen it in official memos, Taylor whispered. Come on, Daniels replied dismissively. He's just another suspect. Let's finish up and move on. Before they could return to Jacob, a black sedan with flashing lights and government plates pulled up. What's going on here? Called a tall black man in a sharp suit as he stepped out of the car. Mr. Franklin, exclaimed a few neighbors, recognizing the city's deputy mayor. Daniels, caught off guard, straightened up instinctively. We're responding to a call about a suspicious individual, sir, he began, but Franklin cut him off. A suspicious individual? Do you realize who you're talking to? This is Jacob Carter, the new chief of police for this district, Franklin said, his tone sharp with authority. The crowd froze. Linda stood rooted in place, her face turning bright red. Officer Taylor looked utterly stunned, while Daniels fumbled with his words, unsure where to put his hands. Finally, Jacob allowed himself a small smile, though his eyes remained cold. I trust this clears up any questions about why I'm walking in my own neighborhood, he said evenly. The silence on Maple Lane was broken only by the whispers of stunned neighbors, exchanging glances of disbelief. Linda, pale and visibly shaken, took a step back, as if trying to disappear into her own shadow. Officers Daniels and Taylor exchanged uneasy looks, realizing the situation had spiraled out of their control. The chief of police? Taylor murmured, glancing again at Jacob's ID. Franklin's stern gaze landed on the officers. So you're detaining the chief of police for walking his dog in his own neighborhood? Is this what protect and serve looks like now? Daniels, trying to salvage his authority, stammered. We were following protocol, sir. We got a call. A call? Franklin cut him off, his voice rising to ensure everyone could hear. A call about a man simply walking his dog? That's your idea of suspicious behavior? Jacob, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward. His voice was calm, but there was steel in his tone. Let's make this clear. The fact that I'm a black man in an affluent neighborhood doesn't make me a criminal. It makes me your neighbor. He turned his gaze to Linda, whose face had turned an alarming shade of red. Mrs. Whitmore, he said, his voice firm, you didn't just call the police. You deliberately made a false report, claiming I was a threat. Do you understand that? Linda opened her mouth, trying to respond, but the words caught in her throat. At that moment, one of the neighbors, a young man holding his phone, called out, This is all on video. I'm posting it online. People need to see how things really work around here. The crowd stirred and many began pulling out their phones to record. Linda, panicked, waved her hands in protest. This is a misunderstanding. I was just trying to protect our neighborhood, she blurted. Protect it from what? Jacob snapped, his voice sharp. From someone who paid just as much for his house as you did and simply wants to enjoy some peace and quiet? Daniels finally attempted to intervene. Sir, perhaps we could resolve this. Resolve this? Jacob's piercing gaze shifted to the officer. You didn't even ask for my side of the story. You immediately assumed the worst. That's not just unprofessional. It's a disgrace to the badge you wear. Franklin stepped closer to Daniels. I'll personally ensure that this incident is reviewed thoroughly, he said, his tone icy. Your bias today could have led to much more serious consequences. The crowd buzzed with murmurs. Linda tried to slip back into her house, but several cameras were already trained on her. All right, show's over, Franklin said, addressing the gathering. Go back to your homes. But remember, the system won't change unless we change the way we think. Jacob gave Franklin a brief nod, took his dog's leash, and walked back toward his house without another word. The crowd began to disperse, but the weight of what had happened lingered in the air, leaving a lasting impression on everyone who had witnessed the scene. The next morning, Maple Lane was buzzing. Videos of the incident had gone viral, sparking outrage and heated discussions online. Comments poured onto Linda's social media. "Shame on you. You're a disgrace." Attempts to defend herself only fueled the backlash. Journalists arrived on Maple Lane, and neighbors who once supported Linda distanced themselves. Others approached Jacob to apologize for their silence. Jacob wasted no time. The day after the incident, he addressed his department. "We must change. There will be no tolerance for bias or discrimination. Yesterday was a wake-up call for all of us." Under his leadership, reforms began, focusing on racial bias training and ethics. Meanwhile, Linda was removed from the HOA and shunned by the community, with neighbors openly calling for inclusivity. At a press conference a week later, Jacob stated, "This wasn't just about me as chief of police. It was about every person who faces this treatment without a title to defend themselves." His words inspired local activism, while protests formed outside Linda's home with signs reading, "No to racism." Watching from behind her curtains, Linda realized her actions had lasting consequences. That evening, Jacob relaxed on his porch, his dog at his side, as a neighbor approached. "Mr. Carter, we admire how you handled this." "Thank you," said the young man. Jacob smiled. "Strength isn't about fighting for yourself. It's about fighting for others."